This is an HP Pavilion Slimline s3300f, a consumer-grade desktop computer from 2008. You may have seen I already covered my Pavilion Slimline s3410n, geez that's a mouthful, a few months ago. Well, this s3300f was bought pretty much in direct response to that. I thought the s7410n was pretty interesting, but it just didn't have much performance due to its mobile Intel Celeron processor. So it was legitimately exciting to me to find this s3300f, which not only appeared to be a newer version with more features, it also contained a full-size desktop CPU, the AMD Athlon 64X2 5000 Plus. And in general, it just had better specs. Needless to say, I was intrigued. That's basically all the story there is to this thing. The main thing about it, just like the S7410N, is that it's a smaller version of HP's normal mid-tower PCs. I covered a Pavilion A6300F a couple years ago, and as it turns out, this S3300F is basically identical to the A6300F in terms of features and hardware, with the only major difference being this machine's Athlon 64 CPU compared to the Pentium dual-core in the A6300F. At this point, normally I'd list out the specs in text, but HP has kindly done that for me with this massive advertisement sticker on the side of the computer. Aside from the AMD CPU, this computer has an NVIDIA Enforce chipset with GeForce 6150 SE graphics. This also shipped with 2GB of RAM, a 500GB hard drive, a DVD-RW drive, built-in wireless, and, unsurprisingly, Windows Vista Home Premium. For the most part, those specs are all still the same. However, in the original acquisition video, I upgraded the RAM to 4GB, and I installed an AMD Radeon HD 5450 on an NVIDIA chipset computer. That's kind of funny. Aside from just having it for fun, there is a reason why this is installed, and that will be obvious later on. As always, I did try looking for old website material on the Wayback Machine, but I couldn't find anything that was archived on HP's website. However, I did find this model on Best Buy's website from 2008 for $550, which honestly doesn't seem to be too bad given this machine's specs. And, interestingly, this machine's price is the same as the A6300F's. And it's not even that far off what the S7410N cost just 2 years prior. Not bad, honestly. There's also another version of this machine with a faster CPU and a TV tuner that cost $700. Visually, this is identical to the A6300F. In general, it looks fine, although I hate glossy plastic on anything, and the entire front panel is like that. It's worth noting, this case is not the same as the S7410N's. As the S3300F, man, I'm gonna go crazy repeating all those model numbers. The S3300F is slightly taller, and overall, just a little bit larger than the S7410N. The S3300F has 2 expansion slots, while the S7410N only has 1. But this thing is still very small and compact. Maybe a little too small. Anyway, time for exterior features. The top of this computer has the power button, which is unusually firm for some reason. The power button also contains the power LED, and there's this clear strip, which is supposed to provide a light bar effect from the power LED, but in practice it just kind of looks strange. Also, just like the previous Pavilions I mentioned, this machine's power LED is a multicolor LED, as it'll go amber when the machine is in sleep mode. This machine has a full-size card reader, just like in the A6300F. Below that is the optical drive, which for some reason has the eject button built into this drive door, which makes ejecting the optical drive feel incredibly awkward. There's another clear plastic bar thing that houses the hard drive LED and the optical drive LED. There's also 2 USB ports, although they're both broken on my unit, and there's a single headphone jack. Below that, there's the Windows Vista and the AMD stickers, and this silver piece slides down and reveals HP's Pocket Media Drive Bay thing, which is a pretty neat way to hide that, I suppose. And when this thing is closed, there is a tiny bit of ventilation by the bottom. The back of the computer has the power supply, PS2 keyboard and mouse ports, a digital audio out port, a spot for a wireless antenna, a VGA port, 4 USB 2.0 ports, a FireWire port, an Ethernet port, and the 2-channel audio ports. As mentioned earlier, this machine has 2 expansion slots. This would have originally had a modem installed, but I took that out for the GPU I put in. There's an unused punch out on the back of the computer, not sure what that's for. There's obviously vent holes on the back of the computer, and there's a Kensington lock slot that runs through the side panel of the computer. Speaking of which, that side panel has nothing but ventilation holes nearby the CPU and chipset coolers, and by the expansion slots in the hard drive. The other side has that HP info sticker, an NVIDIA graphics sticker, more ventilation that is entirely useless because it's blocked by the internal chassis, another HP info sticker with the serial number, the Windows Vista product key, and this massive sticker which is probably regulatory info because of the built-in wireless. Finally, the bottom of the computer has more ventilation holes. There's also this thick rubber strip on the front, and there would have been another towards the rear. However, I took it off as it started shifting around and just becoming this complete sticky bomb. By the way, these are the only rubber feet on the entire computer. There's no rubber feet for placing this computer in a horizontal position. Of course, you can still do that, it's just the computer might move around a lot. I've already spent a lot of time showing this computer's internals, so I'll keep it brief this time. This computer comes apart the same way the S3300f did. 3 screws on the back of the computer removes the side panel, which has the bottom integrated into the side, so it's all just one panel. Just like with the S3300f, I think that makes a lot of sense. It just makes it way easier to work on. Something you might notice is that the media drive bay that's accessible from the front, that's not installed on my unit. It's normally installed in front of the drive cage, but I found out it's incredibly difficult to remove for some reason, and it has to be removed in order for the other drives to be removed, and subsequently basically to be able to work on any of the computer. Since I wasn't going to use it anyway, I decided to just remove it altogether so it wouldn't cause me any pain later on. That's a big design fail in my opinion, although I don't know where else they would have put it. But anyway, the drive cage is completely different on this one. There's this release tab for the optical drive, and the drive itself comes out from the front, which means the front panel has to come off. The problem with that is one of the release tabs for the front panel is buried in a tight spot that I can't reach with my fingers, and thus I have to jab at it with a screwdriver. Again, another inexplicably stupid design. In general, this front panel seems incredibly over-engineered to me. You can see the mechanism for the power button. The actual switch is just above the card reader, which I guess is why it seems firm. The optical drive has one security screw, otherwise it can be pushed out the front of the computer. The hard drive mounts in a similar way to the old Slimline, one security screw and then it can be removed, and it's mounted in this metal bracket. The drive cage can be removed with 3 screws, but this one has cables being run on the side of it, so it's a little bit more difficult to remove. There's not much to say about the expansion slots. The retention bracket is basically identical to the old one, except it accommodates 2 slots instead of 1. The next thing that stands out is the CPU tower cooler. I have thoughts on this, I'll save that for the thermal section. The power supply is similar to the S3300f's, but it's not the same. It still uses that same HP specific 24-pin connector, but this one is much beefier than the old one. And it's also a slightly different layout that has a different, smaller fan. I already mentioned earlier I upgraded the RAM, so there you go. The motherboard in this machine is the Asus M2N61-AR, which is almost a mini ITX board, except it's 1 expansion slot longer. I suppose the S7410N board could probably fit in this case, but not the other way around. This board has 2 RAM slots and 2 SATA ports that are used from the factory. In fact, the only expansion to this machine is the PCI Express X16 slot in addition to the PCI slot. All of the USB headers on this machine are used except for this one, which is what the media drive bay plugged into. The audio header is all the way over here, nearby the audio codec chip. Aside from the CPU itself, most of this board's functions are built into the NVIDIA MCP61 chipset on this board. But there is also this LSI chip, which I believe is for the FireWire, and there's this tiny Realtek ALC888S audio chip. Now you might have noticed this board does not have any Wi-Fi card attached to it. Instead, the Wi-Fi module is this thing screwed in on the back of the computer that plugs into a header on the motherboard. Fascinating. So yeah, that's a brief look at the insides of this machine. It is definitely a lot more complicated than the S3410N. It's definitely not my favorite thing to work on, and in fact, there are some design choices that I think are dumb. But it's a small computer, so it sort of just has to be designed a certain way, and it does incorporate a lot. So overall, no real surprises there. The BIOS on this computer is about as boring as it gets. It's version 5.10 from December of 2007, almost certainly the original revision this computer would have shipped with. The latest version apparently is 5.18 from June of 2008, but I only found it after I filmed this portion of the video. There are some I/O options and some basic power and boot options, and that is it. There are also built-in diagnostics, which is interesting. As for the operating system, that would be Windows Vista Home Premium. I do have that, although I had to restore it from DVDs for this video. Yes, this is actually how this menu is supposed to look. We might as well talk about the restore process, which is honestly pretty uneventful. After the initial recovery process, there is this please wait screen for a little while before rebooting into the out-of-box experience. The only real interesting thing about the out-of-box experience is there's an option to select a couple HP wallpapers. But after the out-of-box experience, this HP Easy setup loads, which despite the over-the-top movie, is pretty much just a prompt for registration. Strangely, even after a system reset, the original owner's information was retained in this menu, and it only went away after I erased the original system recovery partition. That's kind of nuts, and it doesn't seem like it should be that way. This setup also contains the usual data collection prompts. After the system loads to the desktop, it plays this flash animation for the HP Advisor. Very cool. Unsurprisingly, this operating system image does not contain drivers for the HD5450 in this computer, and unfortunately it turns out this card does not want to scale properly, which is incredibly annoying. Oh yeah, and also this happens sometimes. I ended up having to manually zoom in this image so it wouldn't bother me. Quite a bizarre issue. Anyway, the pop-ups continue with this Norton Internet Security window, and the HP Advisor opens on system startup. This machine definitely has no shortage of preloaded crap. Included in the sea of tray icons is a keyboard monitor for when you press like caps lock and stuff. The start menu has the HP Advisor again, and also a link to internet services. And don't worry about that. Software-wise, this machine has Adobe Reader 8, this CyberLink DVD suite, it has shortcuts to eBay and Pandora Internet Radio for some reason. It has HP's own PhotoSmart Essential software and also LightScribe software. It has Microsoft Works 9, this Movie software, which definitely did not irate me. It has a ton of HP games from Wild Tangent. Hey, wait a minute. It has the aforementioned Norton 2007, some dial-up services, Earthlink Total Access, Juno/NetZero, MSN Explorer, and AOL, which crashed the machine for some reason, possibly because there's no modem installed. This also contains diagnostics and the HP Recovery Manager program, Snapfish Picture Mover, and a trial of Microsoft Office 2007 Home and Student. The start menu also contains the user guides for this machine. But we're still not done yet. There's a WeatherBug gadget pre-installed. The Help and Support Center has been taken over by HP, and I thought that would check Media Center, but there weren't any additions there. Finally, I did compare with my s3300f, and I'm pretty sure they are the exact same system image. All of the preloaded software and everything matches. So at least if I didn't get the media with this computer, I would have been able to substitute it with the other one. As a Windows Vista computer, it's fine, but since I was still having this issue with my GPU, I thought I would just upgrade it to Windows 7. I was probably already going to do that anyway, and in fact, that's what the original owner of this computer did. While this somehow solved my display issue, I soon ran into another issue involving CPU ID hardware monitor, which crashed the entire computer upon attempting to read the smart data on the hard drive. I apparently had this issue last time I tried to do this exact thing in the acquisition video, but as you'll soon see, monitoring system thermals was extremely important this time. So in a bizarre twist, this computer ended up with Windows 10, which is what I used on the s3300f. I have no idea why, but somehow hardware monitor works perfectly fine with a computer running Windows 10. It's worth noting, even this upgrade was problematic, as it kept failing with this error. This is apparently resolved by clearing some environment values that aren't necessary anymore, but I ended up cheating by restoring this old image I set up months ago. If it wasn't already obvious, Windows 10 was not at all what I planned to run on this computer, but for what it's worth, it seemed to handle it perfectly fine. The real wildcard with this computer as far as OS compatibility goes seems to be its NVIDIA chipset. Also, the built-in 6150 SE graphics do not support Windows 10 at all and will completely crap out when you try and use them. So suddenly, my GPU was a pretty important thing to have here. So we've made it this far. Now, I think it's time to talk about something important, and that would be this system's thermals. Normally, I would wait until later to cover these, but like I said, I think it's important, and I have a lot to say about this. The short answer is they are incredibly bad. Considering this is a compact machine with a lot of parts packed together into a tight chassis, this isn't really a surprise. Within minutes of powering this machine on, the CPU is running at nearly 70 degrees Celsius. This thing eventually settles around 65 degrees Celsius after Windows is done with its startup crap. But in general, doing anything on this computer is going to result in that temperature increasing. Probably the most significant increase would be playing a 480p YouTube video where this poor CPU exceeded 75 degrees Celsius. The CPU is not the only part of this computer that runs hot. This computer's chipset and RAM also run incredibly hot, if nothing else due to their close proximity to the CPU. Of course, the GPU I added will generate even more heat, but we'll come back to that in a bit. This power supply also runs extremely hot, and even this computer's hard drive and DVD drive get extremely hot under normal use. Basically, every component runs much hotter than it should be. A side effect of that, the case itself gets uncomfortably hot, especially nearby the top where the power supply is, and by the CPU heatsink and exhaust areas. Maybe not dangerously hot, but definitely enough to be startling. Any cord, or in my case, USB drive, that's been plugged into the back of this computer comes out uncomfortably warm. It's probably a miracle that this chipset hasn't fried itself with all the heat in this computer, considering these NVIDIA chipsets, in theory, are also affected by bumpgate, just like NVIDIA GPUs from the time. Basically, this thing is a space heater with a computer attached to it. It's insane. This has to be one of, if not the worst, thermally performing computers I've ever had. You know, my furnace was broken last month, and this thing suddenly was very nice to have. But now that it's much warmer outside, this thing, it's like nuclear. It makes its surrounding area just totally uninhabitable by putting out so much heat. And this is with it out in the open and with a relatively normal ambient temperature. I can't actually imagine putting this computer in an environment where space is limited. I have a feeling when they were designing this computer, they thought heat might be an issue, which is why they went to the extra effort of adding significantly more ventilation than the previous Slimline chassis. I tested this computer without its side panel on, and overall, there weren't any interesting results like there were with the s3300f. Except for one, the CPU. The temperature itself didn't change much, about 5 degrees, but the fan speed did. I've noticed this computer's fan control is extremely unusual. A possible explanation for why this thing runs so warm is that this CPU fan rarely ever spins up beyond its normal 1500-ish RPM speed. Any fan noise that can be heard is likely that tiny power supply fan. I thought maybe this thing would have some kind of Hail Mary mode where it just sets the fan to 100%. But this never does that. I have no idea how fast this fan could go because it literally never does it. With this thing's side panel on, the CPU fan only ramped up once I started benchmarking it, which subsequently jumped the CPU usage to its maximum. And even then, it only jumped up to about 2100 RPM. But that jump in CPU fan speed resulted in the CPU temperature remaining the same under Cinebench as it did while playing a YouTube video at just under 75 degrees Celsius. When the benchmark finishes and the CPU isn't pinned at 100% anymore, the CPU temperature immediately drops several degrees until the fan speed levels out again. Now back to it without the side panel. Running Cinebench again didn't see much change in the CPU temp as I mentioned earlier, but this time the CPU fan speed barely changed at all, with it staying at about 1550 RPM and peaking at just over 1600 RPM. That's like a 600 RPM reduction just from removing the side panel, where it maintained a better temperature just from giving it more air to breathe. Now I was curious if the added heat from the GPU was enough to make any difference with the CPU temperature, so I removed the GPU and retested it, but there was no significant difference from using the integrated video. So I was ready to rip into the CPU cooler just being completely inadequate for this computer. And I still think that. But I think it wouldn't be as big of a problem if this thing's fan control was just better. This is a really unique situation because I actually happen to have another computer with this exact same CPU, the Gateway GT5644E, which has an even more pathetic looking CPU cooler than the HP does. But it's nowhere near as conservative with its fan control. And the result? The Gateway achieves significantly better CPU thermals with a worse cooler. I was really hoping to swap these two and try the HP's cooler on the Gateway motherboard, but this leads to another interesting cooler quirk. You may have noticed this is not a typical AMD socket AM2 cooler mount. This heatsink is for an Intel LGA775 socket. So it's literally impossible for me to mount this thing on the Gateway motherboard. The only explanation I can think of for this, aside from just laziness, is that this chassis and cooler were specifically designed for Intel hardware. And given that this board is custom designed for this chassis anyway, it's not surprising to see it be adapted to fit this specific cooler. This cooler seems designed specifically to accommodate this case, since it's recessed to fit the power supply connector. I really tried everything I could to make this cooler work. I thoroughly repasted this thing more than once, and I completely cleaned out this cooler to make sure there was no stuff built up in the cooler that was interfering with it. I really thought that would help this a lot and this would be way more positive, but it just hasn't worked that way. As a last resort, I considered swapping this cooler for one of my other LGA 775 coolers that would mount to this board. I thought maybe a downdraft cooler would be a better fit for this machine, but I checked every cooler I have, and despite lining up perfectly with the mounting holes, none of them fit because of the power supply connector and also some of the power circuitry that's nearby the CPU socket. I guess the last thing is that the thermals technically aren't causing any problems. I mean, the computer is otherwise working perfectly fine, and there's a good chance if you're not paying attention to it, you would have no idea. But since I do know about it, I think it's clear that even under basic use cases, this computer is at the very least struggling to keep this hardware under control. Actually, there is one issue that was caused from this. This computer was only used by its previous owner for a few years, but despite that, those few years of heat being pumped through the heatsink has severely weakened the plastic bracket used for mounting the fan to its heatsink. When I took this cooler apart, that bracket nearly disintegrated, and I'm pretty sure if I ever try to take this thing off again, it will not go back on. To be honest, we could just stop the video here. This is such a significant issue to me that everything else about this computer doesn't really matter. If you needed to know one thing about this machine above all else, and there is no real solution for that, aside from just not using its components in this chassis, which just kind of defeats any reason to use this over a regular Pavilion A6000 with the same features. But we will continue with the rest of this computer's features, albeit I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Probably the biggest issue I had with the S3300F was that it just wasn't a fast or capable computer. I'm happy to report that this is absolutely not the case with the S3300F, although I'm sure that was probably obvious. In Cinebench, this thing just wrecks the S3300F. Even the single core score is significantly higher, and of course, this has an extra core. Of course, by modern standards, this isn't a fast computer, but it is still way better than the old Slimline. I mean, for better or for worse, this computer can handle Windows 10 and it can do modern web browsing. Although, I've noticed the drivers for the HD 5450 are incredibly poor on Windows 10, since video playback seemed to be very problematic, not just on YouTube, but with other sites that played videos. That's not really this computer's fault, more that this GPU just sucks. But yeah, for a computer from its era, CPU performance seems incredibly acceptable. I mean, again, Windows 10 is just about the worst possible thing that I could have put on this. If this were running like Windows XP, this computer would probably be awesome. Crappy GPU or not, it still is a graphics card. So can this computer game? Well, maybe. If this computer has any gaming potential, it's definitely not with it running Windows 10. Or probably with this graphics card. I noticed this thing was also stuttering a lot because of the mechanical hard drive, but CPU usage was perfectly fine. I only tried a few XP era games, and it did okay, but again, settings had to be really low. I think it's just a combination of these graphics drivers really just being bad. Going back to that hard drive, this machine shipped with a Seagate Barracuda 7200.10 500GB drive, which is an okay drive, I guess, but it's very loud to listen to. This machine also has a LightScribe DVD burner from Philips Light-On, what is otherwise a very ordinary 16x DVD RW drive, although, since it's a SATA drive, it could be used in a more modern machine, and it would probably be a better quality drive than a lot of more modern ones. Both of these drives are basically the same spec as the drives from the A6300F. In fact, I've used the other pair of drives in this computer before. I wouldn't be surprised if these A6300F drives could have been found in one of these Slimlines from the factory. The last thing I care to comment on is this computer's built-in wireless, which is actually a really nice feature for a 2008 computer. This wireless G module is branded as an HP wireless module in software. It's definitely very slow by modern standards, and unfortunately, I snapped the internal antenna that was attached to the front of the computer. It also has another antenna spot that's external, as mentioned earlier, and it does work with just that, but it is extremely slow, and it meant downloading several Steam games was a lot of fun. But still, I think this is a nice feature to have. So there's just not really anything else to say. I went into this not really knowing what to expect, but I have to say, I am thoroughly disappointed, but not surprised. It's such a shame because this computer has a lot of potential to be something decent. I mean, it has a lot of positives. It's got pretty good hardware, it's got a decent selection of ports, but this thing just... the thermals. I don't know, man. I'm sure most people don't give a fuck, but I do. On a basic level, it signals that this is just not designed super well, and or the hardware is just not a good choice for this chassis. It's not very often I have reviews that are this overly negative, but it's just such an issue that I can't really use this thing for very long because it makes my room unbearably hot, which I can't think of anything else I own that is like that. It's just insane to me. I can't really see why it's worth using it over something else. I'm disappointed because I normally like smaller and compact computers as a way to save storage space. But first and foremost, a computer, it has to be functional. And I just don't think this is.